Pam Bondi interrupted Senator John Kennedy during a high-profile policy summit on law enforcement, accusing him, live on stage, of grandstanding for viral clips. What came next? One sentence, no raised voice, no comeback script, just one slow, pointed line that flattened the entire room and made Bondi blink like she knew it was over. Kennedy didn't insult her. He just turned the camera she pointed at him right back on her and on the moment she didn't want America to remember. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us what city you're watching from, because this one ends in silence, not applause. The summit was called Restoring Public Trust in Law Enforcement, a bipartisan gathering hosted in Tampa, Florida. Former prosecutors, current senators, high-ranking police officials, think tank analysts. It wasn't a congressional hearing. It wasn't televised. Just a closed room, by invitation only forum, with media present by permission only. The goal? To find common ground between law enforcement, policymakers, and communities in crisis. The moderators were neutral. The panels were timed. And at the center of the day's schedule, a keynote fireside chat between Florida's own Pam Bondi, former state attorney general and conservative firebrand, and a rotating cast of senators. Only one name raised eyebrows on the RSVP list: Senator John Kennedy. He wasn't on the original lineup. He wasn't even from a hotspot policing state like New York, Illinois, or California. But he had been invited, quietly, after one panelist dropped out at the last minute. The organizers expected him to politely decline. After all, Kennedy was known for committee hearings, floor speeches, and biting cable interviews, not soft policy forums with catered pastries and gift bags. But then, the RSVP came in. Accepted. No further comment, just 2 aides, 1 folder, and a single black pen. When Kennedy walked into the room, heads turned. Bondi noticed. She nodded politely, but her body language said it all. Measured distance. They weren't enemies, but they weren't friends either. And everyone in the room could feel it. The first panel went smoothly. Bondi spoke about the breakdown of trust between cities and sheriffs. She cited polling. She warned against defunding movements. Her tone was sharp but polished. Then she opened the floor to comments from the rotating senators. 2 spoke briefly, both thanking her and echoing her call for bipartisan solutions. Then it was Kennedy's turn. He didn't walk to the podium, didn't shuffle his notes. He simply leaned forward in his seat and asked, "Ms. Bondi, you mentioned that political grandstanding's hurting law enforcement morale. Could you clarify what you mean by that?" The room got still. Bondi looked surprised, not by the question, but by the fact that he was asking it to her directly. She answered coolly, "Sure, Senator. What I mean is, certain politicians, and I'm not naming names, have made a habit of using hearings and media clips to go viral, instead of actually writing policy that helps police departments get the support they need." Kennedy nodded. "Fair enough. So what would that support look like in your view?" She answered again, more cautiously this time. "Real funding, real training, and respect from both sides of the aisle." Kennedy leaned back. "Well, I agree with all 3. I just wonder if public trust is also damaged when prosecutors, again, not naming names, quietly back deals that let violent offenders out with no follow-up, then go on TV to talk about law and order." Bondi narrowed her eyes. The moderator glanced at the clock. "Senator," Bondi said, smile frozen, "this is a policy forum, not a campaign stage." Kennedy smiled right back. "So let's talk policy." And with that, the entire energy in the room shifted. Because Kennedy wasn't there to grandstand. He was there to reframe the definition of who was, and to do it with such precision that no one could claim it was personal. Not yet. But what happened next would make sure everyone knew exactly who the target was. Bondi shifted in her chair. She still smiled, but it was a practiced smile now. One that had seen its share of courtrooms, interviews, and partisan pressure. She turned to the moderator and said, "If we're serious about law enforcement reform, let's start with facts." Then she reached down and pulled out a glossy trifold brochure, the kind usually printed for donors or town hall events. On the front, Florida's Crime Decline 2019-2024. Inside, color-coded bar charts, crime reduction percentages by county, decrease in burglary, assault, and homicides, arrest to prosecution rates, and a bold claim at the bottom of the last page. Florida leads the nation in prosecutorial effectiveness. There were nods around the room. Bondi held it up proudly. When I was AG, we made sure justice was swift. We prioritized law enforcement funding and used common sense prosecution strategies. I'd invite any critic to show me where we failed. Then, looking directly at Kennedy now, because sound bites don't run cities, results do. She placed the brochure down with a little thunk on the table. The moderator turned to Kennedy. Senator, your thoughts? Kennedy didn't move right away. He just slid his folder a few inches forward and opened it. No charts, no bar graphs, just a list. Typed, single-spaced. Titled, Leniency Cases Approved. Florida AG Office, 2016-2019. I appreciate Ms. Bondi's brochure, but I believe the public deserves to see the faces behind those stats. He picked up the list. Let's start with Case 14B. Individual, Raymond Torres, arrested in Miami-Dade for repeat assault, released under discretionary order despite prior violent offenses. A month later, arrested again. This time for attempted murder. The office chose not to prosecute the original assault due to resource constraints. Bondi's expression stiffened. Kennedy continued. Case 22F Tanya Blevins, 3 charges of fentanyl distribution, 2 dismissed before a plea deal was even offered. Convicted on 1 count, sentenced to probation. He looked around the room. The officer who arrested her, Officer Daniel Reese, was shot 3 months later during a follow-up search warrant involving her known associates. A beat of silence. Kennedy flipped the page. Case 31C Tyreek Nash, gang-affiliated, multiple weapons violations, caught in a sting operation, charges reduced after negotiation, released, and now facing new indictments for trafficking and second-degree murder. He finally set the paper down and looked at Bondi. Ma'am, I agree that results matter, but when those results include bargained-down felons and wounded officers, I think we've got a different kind of grandstanding problem. The room was dead silent. No nods now, just stiff backs and darting eyes. Bondi lifted her chin. Those cases were managed by a broad team. I never personally intervened in day-to-day dockets. Kennedy replied softly. I know. That's part of the problem. The moderator glanced at the clock again, this time not for pacing but for control, because what had started as a stat presentation had just turned into a reckoning, and Kennedy had more pages left in that folder. The moderator cleared her throat and gave a polite smile, the kind used in rooms full of political heat and breakable sponsorship deals. We appreciate both perspectives, she said. Perhaps we can shift to shared solutions. But Bondi wasn't ready to move on. She leaned forward, her voice louder now, sharpened with that courtroom cadence she'd perfected in front of juries and press pools. Senator Kennedy, you come here, out of state, with a folder of cherry-picked cases, as if you understand what it takes to keep a state like Florida safe. And frankly, your tone, it doesn't feel like accountability. It feels like grandstanding. The word hung in the air. This wasn't gentle pushback. It was an open accusation. The moderator froze, waiting for Kennedy to respond or laugh it off or deflect. But Kennedy didn't blink. He looked at Bondi, not like a rival, but like a witness he'd been waiting to call. And then, a slight rustle in the back row. A young journalist, credentialed but seated out of direct line of sight, slowly angled her phone upward. No flash, no light. She tapped record. That footage would later hit 12 million views in 3 days. But in the moment, the room had no idea that the exchange was being captured. Kennedy finally responded. Ms. Bondi, if I wanted a viral clip, I'd stand up and yell. If I wanted attention, I'd throw a press conference and speak in slogans. He paused. But I didn't ask for this panel. Didn't ask to speak. I came because one officer from my state lost his life after a plea deal brokered by an office modeled after yours. Silence again. Kennedy turned to the moderator. May I read something? She nodded, unsure. Kennedy reached into his folder and pulled a folded letter. This was written by the widow of Officer Daniel Reese. He was 31, survived by his wife and twin daughters. He unfolded it gently. Dear Senator Kennedy, my husband did not die in combat. He died in paperwork. He died in someone else's calculation of political cost. He died because too many powerful people care more about appearing reasonable than protecting the reasonable. He looked back up. That woman doesn't care about headlines. She cares that her daughters never got to say goodbye. A quiet shuffle. Someone sniffled. And still, no one spoke. Bondi's smile was gone now, replaced with something unreadable. Kennedy folded the letter. So, ma'am, when you say I'm grandstanding, I hear a defense, not a denial. A second of stillness, then a quiet voice from across the room. The police chief from Tallahassee, seated with arms crossed, finally broke the silence. He's not wrong. The panel shifted again, not because of volume, but because someone in uniform had just picked a side, and it wasn't Bondi's. The Tallahassee chief's voice didn't come with a raised hand or moderator's prompt. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't cleared. He just said it, low and steady. He's not wrong. Everyone turned. Pam Bondi froze. Kennedy didn't move. But that line, coming from someone in uniform, someone still active, cracked the performative shell around the summit like glass under pressure. The moderator tried to recover. Chief, would you care to elaborate? He nodded once. His name was Chief Darren Price, 26 years in the force, decorated, respected, known for staying out of the media spotlight. I've sat on task forces, he said. I've co-authored policy drafts, and I've had to call families at 3 a.m. when one of my officers didn't come home. He turned slightly toward Bondi. I've also watched DA offices cut deals because someone in a suit wanted a lowercase backlog before the fiscal quarter closed. Then toward Kennedy. You didn't disrespect this forum, Senator. You respected the badge, and a lot of people in this room know it. They're just too afraid to say it out loud. Bondi's lips parted slightly as if preparing a retort, but none came because Price hadn't insulted RTB Vernerer. He just validated the one person she had tried to frame as theatrical. The moderator hesitated. Chief, we appreciate your candor, though we do want to keep the event focused on constructive, but she was cut off by another voice. This time, a state prosecutor from Palm Beach. I've had to sit across from victim families and explain why someone's sentence was reduced, and I've used the phrase resource constraints more times than I can count. She took a breath. But Senator Kennedy's point isn't that we're all corrupt. It's that we've gotten comfortable calling compromise justice. Now it wasn't just a crack, it was a fracture. What began as an ethical sparring match had become something more dangerous. Consensus. And Bondi, once firmly in control of the stage, suddenly looked like the one trying to keep up. Kennedy hadn't attacked her. He hadn't insulted her credentials, but he had opened a door and let everyone walk through it without asking permission. And once they stepped through, no one looked back. The summit had officially shifted. What was once a policy discussion had turned into something deeper. A moment of reckoning for the room and a quiet unraveling for the person who'd once controlled it. Pam Bondi was no stranger to confrontation. She'd debated live on Fox News, fought lawsuits with billion-dollar stakes, stood toe-to-toe with governors and mayors. But none of that seemed to prepare her for this, because this wasn't a loud fight. There were no insults, no personal attacks, just facts, and something more devastating. A changing atmosphere. Kennedy hadn't taken over the stage. He had let the room do it for him. Chief Price and the Palm Beach prosecutor had already shifted the tone. But now, in the pregnant pause that followed their remarks, the pressure silently landed back on Bondi. She looked around, trying to find someone, anyone, willing to pull the conversation back to her framing. But what she saw were folded arms, furrowed brows, note-taking, not nodding. Finally, she spoke. With all due respect, Senator, I still think it's dangerous to turn these serious issues into public takedowns. We're not on a debate stage. We're in a summit for real solutions. Kennedy just stared ahead, unblinking. She pushed again. What message are we sending to our communities when even the people who should be on our side start pointing fingers instead of fixing problems? And that's when Kennedy leaned forward. No shift in tone, no spike in volume, just one line, spoken softly but with absolute clarity. Miss Bondi, I'm not pointing fingers, I'm pointing mirrors. The room held its breath. He didn't continue, didn't explain, didn't soften the blow. Because he didn't have to. That line, I'm pointing mirrors, landed like a stone in a glass auditorium. No one clapped, but no one interrupted either. Bondi blinked once, then twice. She looked at the moderator, but the moderator was now reading the room. And the room? It wasn't on her side anymore. The next panelist, scheduled to speak after Kennedy, quietly passed a note to the staffer managing the schedule. Delay my segment. Let this finish. At the back of the hall, the journalist who had been filming earlier whispered to her colleague, "That's the quote. That's the one that's going to light up every social feed by tonight." And she was right, because when the footage hit Twitter, just 20 minutes later, it was already cut in caption, "I'm not pointing fingers, I'm pointing mirrors." Senator John Kennedy, July 25. In under 4 hours, it had 4.3 million views. The clip didn't need explanation, didn't need editing. It was the kind of sentence that stood on its own and pushed everything else aside. The summit ended without fanfare. No applause, no media scrum, just quiet gathering of folders, unspoken nods between staffers, and a sense that something real had just happened. Kennedy didn't linger. He slipped out the side hallway with the same calm he'd entered with, folder under arm, no entourage behind him. Bondi? She stayed. Longer than anyone expected. Not to give interviews, but to meet with a few senior law enforcement officials behind closed doors. No one knows what was said in that room, but what happened outside it would define the hours that followed. Around 4:15 p.m., a screenshot began circulating in a private signal group used by state policy aides and legislative staffers from Florida, Georgia, and Louisiana. The message was from someone inside the Bondi orbit, though their identity remained speculative. The text read, "This is what happens when you let Kennedy speak unscripted. We came to reinforce unity, and he turned the whole panel into a judgment booth." A follow-up message said, "She should have seen it coming. He had that folder the moment he sat down." 10 minutes later, the screenshot leaked to a Substack journalist. And by evening, it was posted with the caption, "Internal staff already spinning Bondi's loss at today's summit. Guess the mirrors worked." But that wasn't the only message that made headlines. Because while that leak was boiling over online, Kennedy's phone lit up with a call from a number he hadn't saved, but immediately recognized. Governor Brian Kemp, Georgia, a Republican who walked the line between pro-police and criminal justice reform carefully, and someone who hadn't publicly aligned with Kennedy in years. Kennedy took the call. The conversation was short, barely 4 minutes. But according to a senior aide within Kennedy's circle, the governor's words were this: "What you said today, that's the new middle. You didn't burn the bridge, you walked across it and dared everyone to follow." Kennedy reportedly said only, "Wasn't trying to grandstand," and Kemp answered, "Exactly why it landed." Click. That was it. No formal statements followed. No press release. No post-event roundtable. But the damage or the clarity, depending who you asked, had been done. By that evening, 3 separate sheriffs reposted Kennedy's quote, "I'm not pointing fingers, I'm pointing mirrors." And one of them added, "That's what we've needed for years. Less photo ops, more honesty." Bondi didn't post that day. Her official account stayed silent. Her team declined to comment. But everyone in the political world knew what had just happened. One of the most practiced Republican communicators had lost a room, not to outrage, but to quiet precision. And Kennedy, he didn't even call it a win, because for him, it was never about that. The final hour of the summit wound down quietly. Panelists returned to their hotels. Staffers packed up signage. Caterers cleared the foyer of untouched pastries and lukewarm coffee. The ballroom, once humming with ego, rhetoric, and thin applause, now sat empty. Except for one person, a janitorial staffer named Monica, tasked with resetting the chairs for a separate evening reception, walked in around 6:15 p.m. She didn't expect to find anything left behind. But when she stepped up to the panel stage to gather loose handouts, She noticed something odd. The whiteboard. It hadn't been used for most of the summit. In fact, the only person to even walk near it had been Kennedy. And now across the middle of that glossy, stain-resistant surface was a single line scrawled in Kennedy's unmistakable looping cursive. No underlines, no arrows, just one sentence, written low, just above eye level. The hardest truth to face is the one you helped create. That was it. No name, no reference. But Monica paused when she read it. She took a photo, not because she thought it was political, but because something about the words felt like a warning or a confession. That image would later surface in a closed group chat of Capitol Hill staffers, then onto Reddit, then onto Twitter. And within 24 hours, that photo of an empty room and a quiet sentence had outperformed every press release issued from the event. Commenters didn't argue about it. They just shared it, silently, widely, because sometimes the truth doesn't need a press cycle. Just a clean board and someone brave enough to write it before walking away. Pam Bondi never responded to the moment directly, but 2 weeks later, she was scheduled to speak at a similar summit in Texas. She pulled out, citing scheduling conflicts. No replacement date announced. As for Kennedy, he never mentioned the quote again. Not in speeches, not in interviews, not even when asked. But those who knew him best, his staff, his colleagues, the officers who shook his hand quietly in side halls, all said the same thing. That sentence, yeah, that sounds like him. If Kennedy's reply said what needed to be said, when no one else would, hit like, subscribe, and tell us the moment that hit hardest.